Recently, I've attended the funerals of some very dear friends. And I've reflected on the fact that I'm now closer to the end of my life than to the beginning. And I've wondered if this was the last sermon I was going to preach, what would be the message that I would want to give? What would I want to say? Now, many of you know the longer I live, the less and less I believe. But the little I believe in more and more. There's a whole lot I used to believe that I used to talk about day and night that I just don't talk about anymore. I couldn't care less about it. It doesn't make any difference to me whether it's true or not. But there's one thing among many things, the sine qua non, that I used to believe that I still believe, and I still want to talk about as passionately as I ever did before. And that is the wonderful love of God revealed in the ever-enchanting person of Jesus of Nazareth. I believe that God is love, and that we are made by love, with love, for love. I believe that Jesus embodies God and incarnates God's love in his life. Jesus calls us to love God and to love like God, in whose likeness we are created. And Jesus shows us how we can really, truly and sincerely love others as we love ourselves, including not only our neighbours but also strangers, not only friends but also enemies. And in Jesus we see that in the end, love is not in vain. Love triumphs over hate. Love wins. As a toddler, I believed in Jesus as my relative. My parents were pious people. My father was a pastor and my mother was in the ministry too. We were a close family and my parents talked to us about Jesus as if he were a member of our family. I don't ever recall ever seeing Jesus at our home, but my mum and dad told us about him all the time. In fact, each night before we went to sleep, they'd read a story about him and show us pictures of him in an old Bible story book. I can still remember those pictures of Jesus even now. There was one of him carrying a lamb he'd found on his shoulders, and another of him sitting with some kids, which was my favourite, because the kid he held on his knee looked a lot like me. As a child, I believed in Jesus as my friend. My parents migrated from England to Australia when I was 8 years old. I was uprooted from the only place that I knew and separated from all my relatives, with the exception of Jesus. Coming over on the boat, someone played Somewhere Over the Rainbow when we crossed the equator, but the Antipodes proved to be anything but the magical land of Oz for me. It was uncool to wear shoes to school, and trying to run about the playground in the midday sun on blistering hot rock-hard bitumen in my little pink, soft, bare feet was torture. And what made things worse was that at that time in Australia, it was a crime to have a posh English accent. And I was beaten unmercifully, not only by the students, but by teachers for being a smart-mouthed pommy bastard. Often I felt that Jesus was the only friend I had in the world. As an adolescent, I believed in Jesus as my hero. When I read the Gospels, I saw Jesus in a whole new light. He struck me as a man's man. He said what he meant and he meant what he said. He believed in love and justice and stood up bravely for his beliefs. So Jesus became my role model, and I took every chance I could to be like Jesus. and to do like Jesus. There was a little kid in our neighbourhood that everybody thought was a few sandwiches short of a picnic, and all the kids used to pick on him. But there was one big kid in particular who used to pick on him a lot. What would Jesus do? I asked myself. He'd lay his body on the line to stop that poor blighter from being bullied, I told myself. So I vowed the next time I saw him being attacked, I'd intervene. As it turned out, when I did step in, I got beaten to a pulp and I had to be rushed off to hospital where I had an emergency operation. But my bruises only served to strengthen my admiration as I lay there in my hospital bed for the man who bravely laid down his life for his friends. As an adult, I believed in Jesus as my guru. I went to university in the 60s when revolution was all the rage, and I agreed with much of Marx's analysis of society. But I thought the solutions to problems Christ proposed were far more radical than Marx. In the 70s, I went to India along with the rest of my generation, and I studied Krishna, Moses, Buddha, Muhammad. Much of what they said seemed to me to be the truth. But to me, Christ was the truth of which they spoke. So I spent most of my life setting up intentional, multicultural, interreligious communities based on the uniquely radical, outrageously inclusive, non-violent principles of the rabbi from Nazareth. And at present, I and my family are part of the Waiters Union, which is committed to developing discipleship community with disadvantaged groups of people in our own hometown of Brisbane. These days, as an older man, and as one of the Aboriginal pastors I support calls me, an old man, I feel I need to believe in Jesus more in terms of our Saviour. I guess it's because I've worked as hard as I can for salvation and seen more than my fair share of miraculous transformation in people's lives, yet it would seem to me that in many ways things are not getting better, but are getting worse. In spite of illusions of progress, more than 120 million people were killed in wars during the 20th century, the most bloody century in the whole of human history. And while we watch with horror at the terror attack of America, we turn a blind eye to the alliance-sanctioned war against terror, when over 100,000 innocent victims have been killed. Then there is a climate emergency, which too many of us ignore because of our addiction to greed. We are unwilling or unable to save ourselves. I believe that unless we are transformed by the redeeming love of God revealed in Jesus, we will all be losers. There will be no winners in our world. Given the fact that the heart of the gospel of Jesus is love, I believe it has been a total, unmitigated disaster for the religion founded in his name that the word love is not mentioned, not even once, in any of the creeds which are the founding documents of Christianity. The creeds frame our religion by belief about Jesus without any reference at all to the love of Jesus. Christianity has brought about a brutal litany of crusades and slaughter, inquisitions and torture, and terrible sexual abuse as a result. Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, and you shall love your neighbour as yourself. This is the law of the universe." Paul got the message And he said, owe no one anything except to love one another. For one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Love does no wrong to a neighbour. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbour and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. Paul shows us that he got the message of Jesus when he said, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. But do not be overcome with evil. Rather, overcome evil with good. It was said of Jesus that having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And Jesus said, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Paul extolled the virtues of this love when he said, love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. And he said, faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these three, greater than faith, greater than hope, is love. I can remember a time recently when I shared these verses with a bunch of weary, wrinkled, disillusioned activists who had struggled for justice in my state since the buoyant days of the anti-Vietnam War moratorium in the late 60s. Most of them were hardcore atheists, very cynical about the role that religion had played in supporting the status quo in my state. But they had invited Ange and I, as goddesses, as they called us, to come to their group to share with them about how our God had sustained us in our struggle for justice in spite of our disillusionment. At the end of a very beautiful evening of deep, heartfelt exchange, I asked them if they would permit me to quote a verse of scripture. And they replied by saying, rather sceptically, "Sure, man, preach it to us, brother." So I quoted this verse. Faith, hope, and love abides, these three, but the greatest, greater than faith, greater than hope, is love. And I said, Paul seems to be saying, if we're disillusioned and no longer have any faith in the possibility of change, or have any hope that the next revolution won't be a betrayed revolution, but we still have love, and like you, still practice a wholehearted commitment to caring, compassion, and a radical concern for the welfare and well-being of others, that is what really counts. That is what really matters. When I finished saying this, I heard some people mumble a muffled amen. And as I looked around the room, I saw there were many people in tears. And it seemed to me that the word of the God that they didn't believe in had affirmed them in being the very best they could be as human beings, as it does for me. They say that the only apostle who was not killed when he was young was John. They say when he was an old man, they used to carry him into the congregation on a stretcher. And they say that they used to ask him to preach the gospel to them. And the gospel that he preached was simply a gospel of love. He'd say, God is love. And those who abide in love abide in God. And God abides in them. Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. In this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us. We love because he first loved us. And since God loved us so much, we also ought to love one another. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees his brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? Little children, John would say again and again as an old man. Little children, let us love, not in word or speech, but in truth and action. No one has ever seen God. But if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is perfected in us. And all I can say is, Amen.